All right, guys. Wall Street Journal. Here we go. It says, Pentagon weighs deploying special forces to guard Kyiv embassy. Administration weighs desire to avoid escalating military presence against security of U.S. diplomats in a conflict zone. U.S. military and diplomatic officials are weighing plans to send special forces troops to Kyiv to guard the newly reopened embassy there. By the way, I used to say Kiev, then everybody was saying Kyiv, so I started saying Kyiv. I actually don't know the proper way to say it, but my instinct is to say Kiev, because it's spelled more like that, Kiev. Whatever. I'll probably end up saying it both ways and not settling on any one in particular. Proposals that would force the Biden administration to balance a desire to avoid escalating the U.S. military presence in the war zone against fears for the safety of American diplomats, U.S. officials said. Hey, here's an idea. Why don't you just get the diplomats out too? Why not do that? Instead of sending special forces into a war zone where Russia is at war, thereby risking war with Russia, why don't you just take out the diplomats as well? No. I'm sure they would say, that's appeasement, that's weakness. You can't show weakness, bro. President Biden has yet to be presented with the proposal, but if he approves it, troops would be deployed only for the defense and security of the embassy, which lies within range of Russian missiles, U.S. officials said. Seems like a bad idea if you ask me. And by the way, I've read that line so many times of only defensive purposes. And I wince every time I hear it because in previous contexts, it wasn't defensive at all. Now, in this context, I do think it would be defensive because actively having U.S. soldiers shoot at Russian soldiers is risking World War III in a very direct way. It is an act of World War III, so it might actually be defensive in this respect, but I don't want to roll the dice. I don't want to risk it. Their presence inside Ukraine would mark an escalation from Mr. Biden's initial pledge that no American troops will be sent into the country. Well, would you look at that? He said it 1,000 times, no U.S. troops, no U.S. troops, no U.S. troops, and then he's like, well, maybe a couple. Maybe just the tip. The administration seeks to balance concerns within the State Department that a robust, conspicuous security posture at the embassy could provoke Russian President Vladimir Putin with the need to deter a potential attack on American personnel and have sufficient forces to extract them if fighting breaks out against Kiev. Russia continues to target the Ukrainian capital with occasional airstrikes or shelling, even as the city has begun to return to normal. For now, the State Department will furnish its own security from a corps of guards in the Diplomatic Security Service for the embassy in Kiev. Preliminary planning is underway at the Pentagon and the State Department for possibly dozens of special forces troops who could augment security at the embassy or could stand by to deploy if needed. Look, man, we've already done, 3, 4, 5 different rounds of multi-billion-dollar packages being sent to Ukraine, giving them money, giving them weapons. We were sending them $40 billion in the midst of a baby formula shortage here. I think they're good. We've helped them in every way imaginable, and in fact, the help has gone too far because there are no strings attached to make sure that the weaponry doesn't go to the Azov battalion, the neo-Nazis fighting in the Ukrainian National Guard. So that's a problem, and that's not okay. And it appears like there's no end to the amount of support and weaponry we'll give, no matter what the facts on the ground. And even given that, you're talking about sending U.S. special forces to guard the embassy in Kyiv. Well, first of all, bring the diplomats home. But second of all, if you're not going to do that, I think they could take some of the $40 billion we gave them and have Ukrainian forces guard the embassy. Just a thought. Just a thought. I mean, in addition to using special forces troops to provide security at the embassy, officials are considering restoring a Marine Security Guard detachment like those that normally provide security at embassies around the world. No formal proposals have been sent so far to Defense Secretary Lloyd Austin, Chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, Army General Mark Milley, or Mr. Biden. We are in close touch with our colleagues at the State Department about potential security requirements now that they have resumed operations at the embassy in Kiev, said Pentagon Press Secretary John Kirby in a statement, but no decisions have been made and no specific proposals have been debated at senior levels of the department about the return of U.S. military members to Ukraine for that or any other purpose. Over time, and depending how the conflict in the East unfolds, U.S. officials envision a large presence for the U.S. to administer the tens of billions of dollars of weaponry that have poured into the country in recent months, and some U.S. military officials would like to return to Ukraine the special forces and other troops that were conducting train and advise operations for the Ukrainian military. The embassy in Kiev was all but shuttered by the time Russia invaded Ukraine February 24th. Its diplomatic staff largely relocated 340 miles west to Poland. That's a good idea, with a small group making short trips to a makeshift diplomatic post in Lviv, just inside the Ukraine border. After Mr. Putin failed to achieve a key objective of taking Kiev and installing a puppet government, Russian forces have shifted operations to the east. In late March, Russian forces began to focus on the Donbas region in eastern Ukraine. Although Kiev remains under threat of artillery and missile fire, several key U.S. allies have reopened their embassies or returned to Kiev diplomats who had relocated to other parts of the country. Okay, so I would just wait until the war's over and there's some diplomatic settlement in order to, before we send back in, our diplomats. I just don't want any risk of further escalation. Now, by the way, we had talked about that as soon as Putin shifted from trying to get Kiev and shifted back to the Donbas region, that was good. That's a very positive step. It showed that the resistance in some respects worked, at least around the capital city. It showed he didn't want to invest the money and the blood that he would have needed to overturn Kiev and take it. So now it's back in the Donbas region. There's been contradictory articles left and right about where we're at with Zelensky and Putin. Many articles say Zelensky's basically put everything on the table except disarmament. He said, look, we can have a conversation about the Donbas region. We can have a conversation about Crimea. We can have a conversation about Ukrainian neutrality, which he already conceded. We're not going to be part of NATO. But we're just not going to disarm. That's what some articles say. Other articles say some of those things are not on the table. And they're not going to negotiate over the Donbas region, or they're not going to negotiate over Crimea. I don't know what's going on. All I know is we appear to be at some sort of stalemate. All I know is both Putin and Biden don't look like they're really interested in peace. You need to find an off-ramp, do a diplomatic settlement, and then give peace a chance. Now, look, maybe it doesn't work, and maybe the settlement is breached immediately. Well, we'll cross that bridge when we come to it, but any other alternative is terrifying. Any other alternative, a permanent stalemate for years and years and years where blood continues to be shed, that's terrifying. Further escalation, that's terrifying. I was okay with a aid package going to Ukraine. They have a right to defend themselves, but none of the weapons and none of the money should go to the Azov battalion. They should have been axed from the National Guard immediately. But after that first package, all right, we should be finding an off-ramp. We should be finding a way to de-escalate. But instead, you have the heels are being dug in many respects. From everybody except Zelensky, in my opinion. He's the least bad actor. I think Putin and Biden are sort of escalating further, although Putin's the worst actor, of course, because he illegally invaded a sovereign nation. But we got to find an off-ramp. We got to find a way to not escalate. And when we're having conversations, even about just a tiny number of U.S. troops on the ground to defend the embassy, I don't like the trajectory of this conversation. I don't. So I wouldn't even bring the diplomats in until the war's officially over. But apparently they did. You know what? Take some Ukrainians with weapons that we helped give them and have them look out for the embassy. That's the most straightforward answer. I hope that's the answer he falls on, because he was very clear, no U.S. boots on the ground. Well, if you're now talking about U.S. boots on the ground, that's not good. Ever since Adpocalypse, when YouTube defunded all independent news and politics overnight, we haven't trusted them. We know they can pull the rug out from underneath us at any time. If you enjoy this content, please consider tipping $1 or $2 per month on the Secular Talk Patreon. Link in the video description box below. Thanks for your support.